Now that you have a better understanding of the format of this interactive how-to guide, let's explore the components of a situation model. This diagram shows a complete situation model. In fact, it is the model we will develop step by step throughout the various presentations in this interactive how-to guide. Don't worry about the details of the model itself yet. We will explain those as we go along. The main point is to note that the situation model is meant to provide an overview of the context within which the team is working. It shows how various factors are linked to and influence one another. Ideally, it should represent the major factors influencing the system and should not present so many details that it is overly complex and difficult to follow. At this point, we will not describe all the benefits of a situation model. Those benefits will make themselves apparent as we go through the various presentations, and we'll also list some of those benefits near the end of this module. At this stage, we want to mention that the situation model tool helps you organize and convey a lot of information in a limited space about the status quo of the context or problem of your program. Such practice will facilitate a more informed and focused program design process. While the USAID Program Cycle Operational Policy, ADS 201, does not formally require a context or problem analysis diagram or model, it does recommend this type of diagram as a best practice, and it does require a section within a project appraisal document, the PAD, that examines the root causes underlying the development problem. The ADS 201 also recommends that the activity design process include a problem analysis. There are 4 basic components of a situation model for biodiversity programming. The green box on the right is the biodiversity program scope. This is the broad parameters or rough boundaries, geographic or thematic, for where or on what a program will focus. The light green oval inside the green box is a biodiversity focal interest. This is an element of biodiversity, namely a species, habitat, and/or ecosystem within the defined scope on which the team has chosen to focus. A situation model will often have at least 2 or more biodiversity focal interests. Moving to the left, the pink box is a direct threat, which is a human action or unsustainable use that immediately degrades 1 or more biodiversity focal interests. Some examples include unsustainable logging, overfishing, and poorly planned mega infrastructure. Most situation models include multiple direct threats that often affect multiple biodiversity focal interests. The orange box to the left is a driver. A driver is a constraint, opportunity, or other important variable that positively or negatively influences direct threats. Drivers usually include social, political, legal, cultural, and/or economic forces. Some drivers are also commonly referred to as indirect threats. Although these are the components of a situation model for biodiversity conservation programming, it is not hard to see how the same components would apply to other development sectors. A more realistic situation model will have many drivers, several threats, and several focal interests, and relationships among many of these components. In addition to the basic components of a situation model, your team may find it useful to include other components that help you more explicitly convey the full context within which you are working, as well as communicate some important messages about how biodiversity conservation contributes to international development. For example, you may want to include stresses. A stress is an altered, key ecological attribute of a biodiversity focal interest. Including stresses in your model might help clarify how a direct threat affects a biodiversity focal interest. You may also want to identify ecosystem services. Functioning ecosystem species and habitats provide services that can benefit people. Some concrete examples include water filtration, provision of wild food, or recreational opportunities. Finally, it can be important to show human well-being interests. In the context of biodiversity conservation, human well-being interests are those components of human well-being affected by the status of biodiversity focal interests. Some examples include food security, physical and spiritual health, livelihoods, and safety. Ecosystem services and human well-being interests are also very important, and they are at the heart of why biodiversity conservation is part of development. However, we consider them complementary in the context of planning for biodiversity conservation and teaching this methodology. This interactive how-to guide addresses designing programs to directly affect the biodiversity focal interests and the components contributing to the status of those interests. So, we will focus on those components, but recognize the broader context of biodiversity conservation's role in influencing ecosystem services and human well-being. Nevertheless, in integrated biodiversity programming, where there are other focal interests, it becomes more important to include ecosystem services and human well-being interests in your situation model, as they may be more explicitly part of the focal interests of the integrated program. For teaching purposes and for the sake of saving space, the diagrams in this interactive how-to guide will sometimes include ecosystem services and human well-being interests, and other times not. Each design team will need to make its own decision accordingly, depending on context. In the next presentation, you will learn about how to prepare for developing a situation model.